I think is the single best history of school reform in this country is David Tyack, Larry Cuban, Tinkering Toward Utopia, A Century of School Reform. If there is one sentence from that book which hangs over this morning, it is this sentence. After looking at attempts to change American schools across the 20th century, they conclude, change where it counts the most, in the daily interactions of teachers and students, is the hardest to achieve and the most important. We have just had we are still in the context of a national discussion about school reform, urban school reform, that has not been centrally about either teaching or about building relationships between adults and children. It is centrally about how schools will be governed, how they will be structured, how they will be organized. Those have been the central themes for the last decade and a half. That's beginning to change right now. That's beginning to change partly because of growing disappointment in the kinds of outcomes for youth that we get when we concentrate only on school organization. It's beginning to change because of a remarkable body of research, some of which you'll be exposed to this morning and this afternoon, about the power of social supports for young people. It's beginning to change because of the visibility of new narratives about changing urban schools, narratives like the Harlem's Children's Zone, which are built around the notion of creating strong and deep social webbing around children and thinking about this social development more broadly than in terms of test groups. To talk about these issues, to talk about what we have learned about social supports for children, we have assembled a quite remarkable panel. And I am not going to read the biographies since you have them in front of you. I just want you to be able to associate names with faces. And starting on my left, Sybil Madison-Boyd is the Director of School and Leadership Development for the Urban School Improvement Network here, which is a part of the Urban Education Initiative at the University of Chicago. Next to her, Jennifer Loudon is from the Office of Specialized Services, Chicago Public Schools. Next to her, Bryan Samuels is Chief of Staff for Chicago Public Schools. Next to her, I'm not in a hurry, am I? Next to Bryan, Margaret Beale Spencer, the GSE Board of Overseers Professor of Education and Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. I am so very happy to say that I will probably never have to introduce her that way again, because in January she becomes professor at the University of Chicago, her home, where she got her PhD in the Department of Comparative Human Development. And the broad set of questions that we have asked our panelists to address are up there. What does it mean to build social supports for students? What do we know about the importance of it? How do children become resilient? What is exemplary practice in this area? What are the things that we can do which are likely to have the largest pop, the largest impact? What are the primary challenges to us in doing those things? What keeps us from doing the best that we can do? How do we overcome some of those challenges? What have we learned about working through the forest? And how can institutions such as SSA prepare leaders in this area? And for the 2 SSA graduates? 1 SSA graduate now.
Yeah,
on the panel.
Sorry, thank you.
How do you feel about the adequacy of your training in this area? Right? That's a tough set of questions. We got a pretty tough panel, and we will start with Professor Spencer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Payne, and it does feel very good to be headed home. I'm sitting because I want to be close to the screen, and I also wanted to run through my slides very quickly because I just think that there were themes that I wanted to mention and not plan on going too deeply into any one at this time. In terms of the task, I just feel as if one of the most important things that we can do was not to forget that urban youth are engaged in human development under just very difficult conditions. So the idea is to keep in mind and think dynamically about the role of context at multiple levels, strictly, if you will, from a Bronfenbrenner perspective, acknowledging that we are a part of that context. What we do, how we think about young people makes a difference. So being able to be very flexible about thinking about context matters and reminding everyone that we are, if you will, the sort of micro level part of youth context. And then number two, that we continue to be a not to be a colorblind society. Unfortunately, however, things are looking a whole lot better. I couldn't help but say that. And certainly gender continues to matter, which means for me that boys experience especially an extra set of challenges that we also need to acknowledge, because in terms of considering the entire globe, there are just a very few societies on this globe where the male model is not more valued than the female model. And what that means in terms of challenges and needs for support is that when you have higher expectations, that means then that you have to respond, and that boys experience additional crises trying to respond to expectations that very often the context does not support. Certainly in terms of identifiability matters, that also includes body size, etc., and that we need to also think about a common denominator, and that includes, of course, challenges and diverse challenges that kids experience in these contexts, but also given the focus of this conference, supports also matter. So thinking about issues from a human development perspective, given the context that our youth are exposed to, means that the supports need to be more customized to respond to the challenges that are part of the context, if you're following me. Because my favorite line for this is that we may design supports, but if supports are not up to offsetting the level of challenge that young people are experiencing, then the supportiveness is not there, and it's not very helpful. We've misused resources, and we've also basically undermined expectations because the supports weren't adequate, therefore the resilient outcomes won't be adequate, and we will assume that something's wrong with the kids versus how we customize or not the level of supports needed given the challenges that the kids are confronting. And certainly resiliency, we all know, means getting good outcomes in the face of challenge, making sure we're real clear about the challenge, and we also are very clear about the supports that are needed to offset the challenges in order to get resilient outcomes. And certainly understanding that privilege and entitlement can also be a challenge, can also be problematic, because if you are saddled with privilege, that means then when things get really rough, privilege also protects you from having to cope with challenge, if you're following me. So we're in a context right now, given the downturn of the economy, of just coping with the downside of privilege, as I call it. So the bottom line, too, in terms of those that you work with, certainly not you, that we need to think about vulnerability in new ways also, reminding our coworkers, reminding those with whom we collaborate, that all humans are vulnerable, that all humans are saddled with both supports, but they're protective factors, but they're also saddled with risk factors. That goes for everyone. But too often for the youth that we're concerned about, we equate risk factors with vulnerability. All right, as opposed to understanding that vulnerability also includes protective factors, and that's our potential to provide, if you will, the conditions that reinforce protective factors, and certainly we want resiliency. Context matters in terms of partnering with the city, with the state, with the government, because children, adolescents, as Dr. Roderick shared, they navigate space. That space either promotes or potentially undermines their experiences there. So if a kid's walking through several neighborhoods that look like this versus looking like this and they're going to the same school, when they get there, what they've already had to cope with is totally different. So they may need extra supports just to be ready to take advantage of the learning opportunities. Are you following me? So context at multiple levels, the psychological level, the physical level, those all matter and must be addressed in terms of appropriate supports. What this means then in terms of net vulnerability, we're always talking about risk and protective factors. The risk factors can be a myriad, if you will, types, and so can protective factors in terms of what you do to offset them. But we have to look at our children with the idea in mind that we have to customize those supports to offset their particular set of risk factors. All right? So the risk factors then are experiences a variety of challenges at multiple levels of the ecology as described by Brofenbrenner and others, and therefore, as I shared, the protective factors are experienced in real time as different types of social supports. So therefore, what we're talking then about is the fact that as part of human vulnerability, we're always experiencing some degree of net stress, right? And it's the net stress then that's manifested as multiple levels of challenges and therefore multiple types of support that are necessary. And for example, in some cases, challenges can be inadequate educational options, inadequate housing, living in dangerous neighborhoods. Adolescents in particular need to navigate. Therefore, the necessary supports to offset them have to be equally significant and come in combinations that make sense, given the level of net stress and challenge. So what's important for us here in terms of what you do, what we can do to make a difference, is that the net stress and those challenges, then we have to understand that kids are responding to them in either maladaptive ways or adaptive ways, right? And certainly in terms of, even good kids, they sometimes make bad decisions in terms of the models that they're exposed to or what is not being described to them in terms of what's dangerous. And in many ways, we see it all the time. And for example, for my work in particular, in terms of the maladaptive ways that boys in particular very often cope when they're living under very highly challenging conditions, is taking on a bravado orientation. You see it all the time, right? You see the walk, you see the style, you see the messages that they're trying to communicate. But what they're telling the world is that I have a Y chromosome and I'm a tough kid. I'm tough in terms of I know I'm a good guy. So I use my gender in ways of communicating that, yes, I'm all of that, ladies. But the point here is to simply share that their Y chromosome meets the expectations that globally we impose on males, if you're following me. However, the bravado behavior communicates to the men in blue, our police officers very often, that this kid is trouble. So therefore, the very potential source of societally paid for supports becomes a source of challenge. Are you following? In Philadelphia, I work with the Disproportionate Minority Contact Committee, which is part of the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. And our job in terms of trying to turn the officers, our police officers, into supports as opposed to challenges because they misconstrue the bravado behavior of our fellows, is to put everybody on panels together so that everybody understands each other's perspective. The police officers want to go home to their families safely, and the boys are just trying to be adolescents, maintaining their sense of manhood in their transition from adolescence. Are you following me? And so the issue then is that the normal, if you will, meaning-making perceptual process that youth, in essence, and police officers engage in, making sure that they're accurate portrayals of the other. So that police officers know that boys are just being adolescents under these low-resource conditions and protecting their manhood. And the boys need to know that police officers are also men protecting their manhood in the delivery of their professional role. But they also wish to go home to their families. So in that case, that's all we do, is to familiarize each other with the other's goals and needs. And we decrease the contact of youth with the criminal justice system. Because once you're in it, it's hard to get out of it. So it's manageable. We can do this. So reactive coping, I'm saying theoretically, is simply a matter of, in real time, how young people respond to the challenges, respond to the risk, and the goal for us then, as supports, is to make sure that we expose them to models of adaptive coping that allows them to maintain their sense of manhood, their achievement orientation, etc., by ratcheting up those supports. What's important about this whole process is that when the kids, when our youth engage in the same coping behaviors long enough in terms of reactive coping behavior, if they're positive, thank you, I've got 2 minutes. The redundancy becomes internalized as an identity, either negative or positive. So it's really important, because then when things happen in the future, if it's internalized as an identity, they're on automatic, right? Okay, I've got 5 minutes left. Thank you. I told them to warn me. So therefore, another part of this process in terms of what we do is to provide opportunities for kids to achieve a positive identity. Certainly, leadership programs play a huge role in basically reaffirming positive identifications that allow kids to respond to challenge in very consistent ways that are much more positive and would set them off on a better and more positive life course outcome. Adaptive responses such as, being reinforced to be a scholar, be an athlete, in essence having a positive ethnic identity, recognizing that in this society still race ethnicity matters, being involved in terms of knowing that I have resources that can be used to help others. So these are all opportunities to reaffirm positive adaptive responses that are internalized as a positive identity. And what's important ultimately is that the positive identities have implications for positive coping outcomes, right? As opposed to negative coping outcomes. And what's important here is that those outcomes then, as a systems theoretical framework, what does it do? It basically undergirds either one's level of protective vulnerability by, in essence, increasing protective factors, right? Or either increasing risk factors. So you're thinking about development from pre-K straight through pipeline going to college. These processes are happening all the time, except they're happening under diverse conditions. And we are the context for those conditions. So how we think about their development, the kinds of supports then that we customize to offset the challenges and the risks that they're confronted with obviously make a difference. So I start off by saying, yes, all humans are vulnerable, and all humans at very different developmental periods. We want productive coping outcomes for them, and what I just suggested is that how we need to design the supports to get those better outcomes can be of several types. One can focus on decreasing the net stress, right, that youngsters are exposed to. We can instead talk about providing or structuring environments to provide more positive, adaptive, reactive coping methods, and also, like leadership programs, reaffirm youngsters' positive identities. The point I'm making here is that vulnerability is a part of the human experience, and youngsters, even from the same family, experience different risks as a function of basic things like temperament. You might have one kid who's basically very, very laid back in style, and another kid who responds to everything. We have to customize supports to adjust to the needs of all youngsters in that same family. And we don't do that enough. My view is that we're not using our understanding of basic human development to maximize the supports, the positive reactive coping models, the positive identifications, etc., that will help us get the resilient outcomes that we want for all of our young people. And it's possible because we've tested with empirical demonstrations aspects of the how of this model, and we know something as simple as monetary incentives. When you live under, high resource conditions, you don't think 2 seconds about providing, an allowance for your child that allows that kid to deal with adolescent needs. If you're in a low resource family, you may not have that option, and kids will use other strategies to get their needs met. My point here is that we had very modest monthly incentives that were based upon academic achievement. And what we found, even though it was a randomized field trial, we provided monetary incentives over their entire high school career if they earned them. What we found is that we could have given them monetary incentives for just 1 year because it made an impact on achievement orientation, kids staying in school school, kids graduating, kids thinking differently about how they reacted to school-based challenges. But we found that the 1 year made a huge difference. We didn't have to waste money on 3 years, because what happened is that the monetary incentive provided a new identity for kids. They viewed themselves from these low-resource families as not as resource takers, but resource providers, because a civic activity was also linked to the receipt of monetary incentives. So they were given money to take care of some of their basic needs. It was a big deal in this one state in particular, when even the head of the local paper wrote an article and said, "Oh, researchers are giving kids money to." Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, wrap up. Okay, that researchers are giving kids money to go to school. Well, in fact, that was not the case, and the kids were given just a monetary amount, a basic and small. Sorry, I'm going to.
No, you're fine.
I'm going to just. Okay.
You're okay.
My point here is that we've designed studies to demonstrate that we can provide different types of supports that make a difference, that represent the different components of human development needs. And we can make a difference in terms of getting resiliency, but resiliency still means that we have to look at both the challenges and the risk, but also customized supports, and we can make a difference in the lives of kids. Thank you very much.
Good morning again. As Charles indicated, I'm Bryan Samuels. I'm the Chief of Staff at the Chicago Public School System. And Jennifer and I are going to spend some time this morning talking about some of the work that we're doing at CPS, and certainly would welcome comments and feedback when and where that's appropriate. As most of you know, both here in Chicago and across the nation, schools are really being driven by test scores. They're really being driven by demonstrating that the money being invested in those schools are making a difference. Now, whether test scores and making a difference are one and the same thing, I think there are a lot of people in this room that are probably more qualified to come to that conclusion than I am. But it's clear in the 2 years that I've been at the Chicago Public Schools that test scores really do drive the thinking. And the result of that, I think, however, in Chicago has been healthy in the sense that it's created an atmosphere of innovation and change that's pretty unique. You have a CEO and a mayor who is really challenging everybody to think outside the box. We have the largest, fastest growing charter school system in the country. Not an accident. We have an increasing number of performance and contract schools. Not an accident. Over the last 3 years, we've introduced this turnaround model. Talk some about that in a little bit. Not an accident. But at the end of the day, all of those things are really driven by the hope that we can find some models that work better than others in improving the academic performance of young people. And to the extent to which test scores are the measure, then Chicago its decision to focus on these innovations makes sense in this respect. Test scores have gotten better for each of the last 7 years in a row, and those test scores have improved at twice the rate of the state. And so in some respects, the data itself validates the focus and the approach that we're taking. However, at the same time, what most everybody in this room knows is, however, that with all of that progress, it hasn't changed the achievement gap. In fact, there's probably a decent amount of information out there that would suggest that the achievement gap is growing, not closing, at the same time that the test scores are getting better. So one of the projects that we began last year that we'll talk some about is an attempt to reshape the way schools are organized and work through what's called the turnaround model. And in its simplest description, the turnaround model is a strategy in which you leave the children who are attending the school in the school and you replace all of the adults. And believe it or not, that's a preferable strategy than just closing the school and redistributing the children to other schools. We can talk about that one later. So it is an approach that says that we really want to be able to wipe the slate clean and start over. And for those of us who have spent some time either in clinical roles or in the human service delivery process, this turnaround model actually represented an opportunity for us to get in the game a little bit, to have a little skin in the game by really challenging the work and the thinking at CPS around what are we doing around the social and emotional learning for this group of students. How are we organizing the schools in ways that might be more supportive of the needs that they have? And so in that process, in those discussions, in the conceptualization of what these turnaround models have looked like, we've been able to introduce issues around behavior, trauma and exposure to violence, and resiliency, and to have a discussion about what role those issues play in the ability of young people to learn and to keep pace with their peers, both in the city as well as in the state. And so in that process, with this year being the first of them, we've introduced a behavioral health strategy into the schools that were turned around the start of this academic year. There are 4 elementary schools that were turned around and 2 high schools that were turned around. 3 of those schools, 1 high school and 2 elementary schools, are on the south side of Chicago, and 1 high school and 2 elementary schools are on the west side of Chicago. As most of you also know, through reading in the papers, one of the challenges we also have at CPS, is the apparent growth in the overall youth violence within the city, and actually there's a real sense that we're in the midst of a public health crisis. 2 interesting things to look at is if you look at youth crime over time, it's not altogether clear that this is a distinctly different pattern than we've seen for a long time. I think it's gotten a lot of attention, and certainly we're focused on it, but I don't know that it's a big change. But we can have that discussion another time. The only point that I would make is this. In some respects, the discussion around the issues around violence for young people, at least in Chicago, has focused on the number of youth who have been killed. It's a far more compelling issue, I think, is to look at the number of youth who have been shot. If you look at the number of CPS students that have been shot, it grossly exceeds anything related to the number of students who have been killed. So if you just go back into 1997, the beginning of the last school year, and you come forward, what we know is that we can document that there are at least 406 students who have been shot, in addition to those who have been killed. Moreover, what we also can tell you based on police statistics is that 406 number underrepresents the actual level of violence that young people are exposed to, because those 406 students had to, by definition, be actively enrolled in a school in order to be counted as one of the youth who were shot or killed. So if you take the school-age population, regardless of whether they're enrolled or not enrolled in a school, the number is twice that. And so my point in making this is at the same time we're trying to figure out how to deal with test scores and how to get better faster, you've got a situation in the community that whether it's changing or not, provides a context in which to begin to try to understand what the impact of the community violence may be having on the behavior of students in schools, and what's the relationship between that behavior in school and their ability to perform well on statewide tests. So the approach that we've taken in some respects in the turnaround schools around behavior is to try to convince both the faculty as well as the administration that behavior is learned. No news to anybody here. And that sometimes behavior that's inconsistent with the rules that are set in the school may be related to adolescence, for example, child development. It also may be a reflection of coping. And the reality is if a kid is on a developmental track and his behavior goes in a certain way, we've learned how to deal with age-appropriate behavior. What we don't do a good job of is being able to differentiate that behavior from the behavior that's the result of coping. They're treated all as the same. And as most of you would conclude, they're probably not equally served by the same strategy. So the conversation is in part getting people to recognize the relationship between behavior and academics, and in part the challenge has been to convince them that a focus on behavior will ultimately impact the focus that many have on improving test scores. So we brought you two slides that we use often to talk about this. This slide has four lines on them, and I'll quickly walk through them because you may not all be able to see them. It is a chart that shows elementary school test scores from 2001 to 2007. And the very top line on the chart, the blue line, is the average improvement of test scores in the Chicago public school system. So that you can see that since 2001, on test scores, CPS on average has improved pretty significantly. There's a large improvement there that right there around 2005, 2006 that people tend to focus on, and the best explanation for that significant increase is actually a change in the format of the test, not a new curriculum that we introduced. So that's the one line, and that's the line that everybody really keeps track of. The second line comes from some really quick and dirty analysis we did using the student survey. As you know, Chicago public schools the last couple of years have surveyed students on all kinds of their attitudes and feelings and experiences of the school. But one of those questions asks, do you feel safe in your school? And so what we did was just we took the schools, their test scores, and the response to that question, and we put them into quartiles. And this is the bottom quartile. This is the quartile where kids essentially say they feel the least safe in their school. And as you can see, those schools in 2001 were lower performers than the average, and they are in 2007 lower performers than the average. And if you could measure the distance between the gap between the two in 2001 and 2007, you'd see that the gap was smaller in 2001 than it was 2007. Said differently, the gap is growing between the average CPS school and the bottom quartile school that reports that kids don't feel safe in their school. The next one is about reported misconduct. All we did was take the schools, divide them into quartiles, and we mapped for you, in this particular chart, the bottom quartile. This is the set of schools who have the greatest number of reports of misconduct per capita. And as you can see, in 2001, those schools were lower than the average. In 2007, they're lower than the average. And if you could measure them with a little ruler, you'd see that the gap is bigger in 2007 than it was in 2001. And then the last one we charted for you is the turnaround schools. So these are the 4 elementary schools that were turned around. Where were their test scores in 2001 and 2007? And again, in 2007, the gap is larger than it was in 2001. So in some respects, even though Chicago Public Schools has made significant progress, and we can say that our scores have improved at twice the rate of the state's, for some schools, the gap is actually getting bigger. Not surprising. So I'm only going to make 2 points, and then I'll shut up and let Jen talk. So what we've been focused on is trying to think through for schools for which there is a strong negative correlation between behavior and test scores, what the proper intervention is. And clearly the 4 turnaround schools fall into that category. And we had the benefit of some research by Chapin Hall, which allowed us to move just beyond this simple math here to really think about correlation and think about really in more sophisticated ways what's the relationship between behavior and test scores. And so in a lot of ways what we've been trying to do is trying to think through how do you help students that are exposed to these issues and who are challenged by behavior really redirect their behavior in ways that allow them to improve test scores. And I'd love to be able to try to convince you and everybody else that helping young people deal with these issues are good in and of themselves. But in public education, if we can't demonstrate that there's a relationship between the two, we have a very difficult time keeping the attention of those who are responsible for our kids day to day. Make one last point, and that is that I think the largest challenge to making this shift is a mindset. And what I mean by that is that I think that in many respects, this is a novice view of it maybe, but in many respects, public education is organized predominantly by the guiding principle of carrot and stick. That almost all of the structures we create, from the grading system to who gets to go to recess or not, is based on the premise that you try to give a student a really attractive thing to shoot for or something really bad. And when given those choices, students will always choose the good thing over the bad thing. In economics, sometimes they call that a rational actor model, but that's the way we're organized. And so when you look at the way in which we've created incentives and disincentives for kids to behave, it's based on the premise that students are choosing to behave in certain ways. And therefore, they can choose to behave in another way, and if they choose to behave in that other way, they get rewarded. And sooner or later, they'll figure out how to conform their behavior to get the reward or to avoid the punishment. And so I think our challenge in thinking, particularly in these violent communities, how to redirect their test scores by changing their behavior requires that we move beyond just the carrot and stick approach. And I will use my own life as just one example to ask you to think about this and how we might rethink the way we're approaching this, which is, and some of you know this, I grew up in a pretty crazy household. My mother was absolutely crazy, both in the real sense as well as in the experiential way. She was probably bipolar and manic depressive at the same time. She self-medicated forever. She had a very difficult life, and she woke up one day and she had 3 kids under the age of 4, and a husband had just been shot and killed. So she had lots of challenges in front of her, and she never really got any better at dealing with those challenges. But in that context, one of the things that she had to do, because she was a self-medicator, was she had to find some other ways of supplementing the income in our household. And so there were, on a number of occasions, the way to supplement our income was to sell drugs. And so over time, what I came to understand as a child was that there was actually a relationship between my mother selling drugs and what food was in the refrigerator and in the cabinets. And so on those occasions when my brother and I were in the home alone and someone knocked on the side door, and the only people who knock on the side door for a reason, and the reason they're knocking on the side door is because they want to buy something, and it also means that they have money, and if they have money, that money then puts food in the refrigerator. I as a child have to make a decision. Am I going to go to the side door? Am I going to open the door? Am I going to take the money? Am I going to give the drugs to the guy? And am I going to put the money in the drawer where you keep the money? My brothers and I came to make those decisions fairly quickly, and we made them on a regular basis. But as a youth who is evaluating on a day-to-day basis life against selling drugs, if you tell me that I'm not supposed to do something, and if I do that, the end result is that I'm going to be suspended from school, I evaluate risk at a very different level than whether I'm going to be suspended or not. Jen's going to talk about, so then, how do we try to frame thinking about this a different way?
Thank you. I love to follow that story. My first career was a teacher, so I warned Charles I might have to stand up. I'm not sure I can talk sitting down. But I'll give it a shot. Can you pass me? So, thank you. So what does this mean in terms of implementation? Most of you know that CPS has 625, 50, 75 schools, depending on how you count. But there's a lot of buildings, there's a lot of students, and there's a lot of adults who work in those buildings and with those students, some of whom are our employees and some of whom are not our employees. And so we had to make some decisions about how do we take these beliefs about what is important for kids and what is fundamentally critical to continue to address test scores and turn them into something that can be implemented by people in schools. And so we essentially looked at these three goals. We talked about the performance of struggling learners. We talked about looking at behavioral health barriers to learning, and I'll describe how we've contextualized that. And we really have emphasized looking at evidence-based practices. Most of you know there's thousands and thousands of people who'll be happy to sell you something that they will tell you will work. But in a system this size, and in most schools, nothing will work for every kid or every teacher. So we've really looked at trying to concentrate on at least practices that are evidence-based and that have worked in similar communities and are culturally competent and responsive. But to do this, we looked at a three-tiered model, recognizing that we have to first look at the learning climate, so the context of school, as well as how do we customize different supports for different kids within that learning climate. We've looked at data-driven decision-making to figure out which students, which classrooms, which schools need different kinds of supports, because we know that one size will not fit all in our system. And we've looked at how the district can be really consistent and coherent in our support of those strategies. I think we've, through grants and other mechanisms over time, had more of a spray and pray sort of approach to helping schools make these kinds of changes than is going to be productive as we move forward into the future. So we've looked at how do we organize the district to be more supportive of a concrete strategy like this. I'm going to flip all this up. And so this is essentially really basic, and I'm sure the vast majority of you have seen this before, but it's been really instrumental in helping people throughout the district think about what does it mean to have a three-tiered model to support students. On the right-hand side, you see academic systems, and on the sorry, left, right, right, left. It's my own personal learning problem. Academic systems and behavioral systems, we recognize, and I think you heard Bryan talk about how deeply these things are integrated, but we're working within a system where these are new concepts for people. So we're trying to help people think about what are the different kinds of supports we're already using and how are they effective in this way, where do we see gaps. In the green section is essentially the context of the learning climate. So for academics, that means what's your high quality instructional practices? Are you using an evidence-based curriculum? And are you implementing it as it's intended to be implemented? On the behavioral side, that goes to school climate, student skill building, and classroom management. And we put classroom management on the behavioral side, not the academic side, because it's really about building adult skills to interact with students, and to interact with students at different developmental levels, to interact with students who are coming from different places and have different experiences and have different coping skills, and to be able to do that effectively in a classroom of 26 or 30 or 34 on occasion. In a way that allows them to deliver instruction on an ongoing basis. And so that's a really significant set of skills for adults. And many, many, many people do not acquire these skills in their pre-service training. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to articulate strategies that will help us work with schools to implement just a structured learning climate. I'm going to talk about a few just on the behavioral health side in the interest of time. For the student skill building, we are in the elementary schools, we are looking at Second Step, which is a social skill building curriculum that's been demonstrated to reduce involvement in violent behaviors subsequent to implementation. It's very teacher friendly. It's called a curriculum, so teachers love it. And it's pretty easy to deliver. But it also includes role play and video reflections and vignettes. So it's active for kids. It's not, I'm going to say it, boring. And for adult skill building, or at the high school level, we're looking at Lion's Quest, which does something really similar. So that's recognizing that all of our students don't come into schools with the same set of skills that they need to participate in the learning climate in the way that we want them to, and as Bryan said, we do have the opportunity to teach them these skills. We know they need a different set of skills in many cases to be safe out in the community, and that has to be okay. We can't tell them that's not okay, because that's not going to help them. But we do have the opportunity to teach them a different set of skills that we would like them to have to be successful while they're in school. Obviously, the research shows that these will carry over, but in terms of hooking in teachers, that's the explanation that we've used. We've also been working with adults in some of our buildings on de-escalation skills. So when students are escalating or responding to things with their normal coping skills that make sense in the community and make sense at home, how can adults in our building respond productively to help them de-escalate? Because in many cases, everyone from the principal to the teacher to security, if they respond from the carrot and stick perspective, are going to unintentionally make the situation worse, which will result in more suspensions, which will result in fewer days in school, which will lower your academic achievement. And we've also been focusing a lot on where does classroom management wrap around those two things. And that's, I think, has been one of our more significant challenges. There's definitely not a product out there I can tell you about that we're ready to use, but we're in the process sort of identifying what are the skill pieces that teachers and other school staff need to build that consistent learning climate that works for our students given where they're coming from, and that's flexible and adaptable in a district of our size. So that's a very active, intensive project for this year so that we can work with folks to have something to deliver to the current turnaround schools and a potentially new set of schools for next year. At the yellow stage, which is the strategic supports, we've been working to identify what is evidence-based, thank you, for students who need more support. The goal is if we do the learning climate and the context in that green section really well, we're capturing most kids. And But that's not going to work for all of our students. We know that. They come in with different experiences. They're going to need some kids will need more intensive support. And so in the yellow level, we're looking at a few manualized interventions, one being anger coping, which is a cognitive behavioral intervention, and one being cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools, both of which have been used in urban districts, including Los Angeles. And we are starting to implement those two strategies this year in a targeted set of schools that are most challenged, and including the turnaround schools, a set of schools in South Shore, and a set of schools citywide, elementary and high school. And so those are two of the strategies we have identified at that level, and there's more, but I'm going to run out of time, so see me afterwards if you have more questions. And then at the red level, we have to recognize that we do have students who are in significant need of stabilizing supports. They're involved in multiple systems, whether it's justice, whether it's foster care systems, other systems. They're just either from time to time or on a regular basis in need of a tremendous amount of support. And in the absence of this model, those are in some cases, 3 or 4 or 5 kids that eat up a lot of time and resources in the school building. And I see some of my colleagues who are in schools nodding their heads. And the school tends to spin their wheels. What do we do with these kids? What do we do with these kids? What do we do with these kids? And so at that level, we're looking at ways we can partner really strategically with community-based partners and especially community mental health providers to provide the rigorous, intensive, structured support that those students and likely their families also need. We sort of recognize that although we want to be the entry point for those services, as a school system, we're unlikely to be able to build that capacity internally. And so how do we work with our partners to build that capacity for students effectively over time? So that's the basic structure of the model that we're working with. In terms of how do you actually implement that at a school? Or 50 schools? I can't think bigger than 50 right now. We've focused a lot on staff capacity and building staff capacity to do this work. And for us, staff capacity means 2 things. It means our CPS staff, so our social workers, our psychologists, our counselors, our teachers, our principals, our administrators, our security staff. But it also means our community partners. The vast majority of our buildings have some community partners. Some of them have a lot of community partners doing something in the building. Something might be really supportive and effective, and something that might not be as strategic or targeted as we would like. And so we've really defined capacity broadly, recognizing that as a school system, we're unlikely to be able to accomplish this alone. So just as an example, with the anger coping and CBITS training, we've been paying not only to have our staff trained, but to have the staff of community partners who are also in the targeted schools trained, so that those individuals can co-implement the group, which builds a lot of capacity over time and also helps cover us in case one of those adults are not there. The intervention can go on. The staff capacity thing, I think, is really challenging because it's, of course, as most of you know, a lot more than just sending people to a training. Especially for our internal staff, represents a transition in the way they think about serving students, and it represents a transition from, deficit-based ad hoc services to trying to do focused skill building. We're sort of trying to recognize that we're never going to fix everything, but we do have an opportunity to build skills in students that will help them be better problem solvers and better decision makers over time. And that is our opportunity as a school system to not only help them succeed in school, but to build the skills that they will need throughout their life. So part of building staff capacity is to help them engage in that thought transition, which most people have been really open to. It's been a really exciting process so far. At the school level, so if you take 50 schools and assume we've built staff capacity, and I would say assume because we're still working on it, At a school level, implementation has also been really interesting because it's required a lot of collaboration at a school site. Many of our school sites have, let's say, 4 or 5 or 6 people between their CPS staff and their community partner staff who need to work together for 2 big purposes. One, to figure out which kids need those strategic and intensive supports and how it's going to get provided and if it's working. And so there's a lot of role clarity and collaborative responsibility that wasn't there before in some cases that has to be established, both within CPS staff and between CPS staff and community partners. But there is also the need to work with teachers in that green zone, because again, with teachers, we can send them to a lot of training. And in some cases, we've done 6 or 7 days of training with full school faculties. But then when you have students in front of you and you're in a classroom by yourself with 25 students, and this I know way too well from experience, implementation is a totally different ballgame. So how do we prepare our staff and community partners to be sources of support, to go in and co-implement classroom management strategies, to go in and co-implement social skill building strategies with teachers? And that's been another challenge because that's outside of the realm of what most school social workers or school psychologists think of as their work. And again, people are open to that for the most part, but it's new. You're going to give me a 1-minute warning, right? Good, thank you. Okay. So in terms of lessons learned and challenges, I think I've covered a lot of those. It's, for me, a really phenomenally exciting time to be doing this work. There's a lot of goodwill within the system. There's a lot of incredible energy. But the amount of time that's required to even make this work in one school, I think, cannot be overestimated. And everybody wants what's best for the kids, but the process of agreeing that we're going to try an evidence-based strategy and we're going to implement it with fidelity, no matter who gets shot or no matter who doesn't come to school or no matter which parent is waiting to see you, is a new challenge for the system. But it's also an opportunity for a new conversation. And people have been really responsive to that because it is about quality practice and it is not about IEP minutes. Sorry, did I say that? But we have talked about how to hybridize the two. I mean, they're not separate. So that's a longer conversation. That's a whole presentation by itself, and Charles will kill me. In terms of, and I know I'm the only alum, so I got to address that, right? There are lots of alumni in the room who are working at a Chicago public school right now, either as a community partner or as one of our employees. Could you raise your hands so people can see you, please? Really high. Really high. Thank you. So these are good people to talk to, too, because these are people who can tell you the truth about what it would mean to do this kind of work or what it does mean to do this kind of work in their building. My experience at SSA, I think, in some ways prepared me really well. I love research. I was a data geek when I got here, and I think that I'm now like a third order of the data geeks. I don't know what the system is, but I'm up there. And so, but I also learned to talk to real people because of the chance to work not just with administrative students, but clinical students. And so I can have a conversation with a teacher or school social worker around evidence-based practice or around data or around the outcomes that we're seeing or not seeing and have it be about their practice. And it's not necessarily about a set of numbers that they don't understand or don't want to engage in or a graph that they aren't used to reading, but it's about their work with kids and what we're learning about it and what we can do to make it better. And I think that is the fundamental core of my preparation here that has made a substantial difference. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Again, my name is Sybil Madison-Boyd, and I'm with the Urban Education Institute here on the campus. And really excited to be on the panel, and I think I'm going to reiterate a lot of what has already been said. My remarks are lodged in the work that I've done in the past 5 years at the Institute, on the ground in schools, coaching social workers, social support teams, principals, and teachers. And it's also kind of backed or founded in my training as a clinical and community psychologist, who spent all of her years studying resilience and studying the work of Dr. Bill Spencer and others, so coming from that perspective. When I think about, and my slide is the guiding questions slide because I kind of frame my remarks around the guiding questions. And when I approach that task, I always put academic and social supports together because I believe they're inextricably linked. So it's really hard for me to think about social supports without thinking about academic supports. In our work, we have a network of 17 schools. We're really trying to support schools in helping students develop specific knowledge and skills and competencies that support their development of active citizens in the world, who are aware of the unique skills and talents that they're contributing to society. And to do that well, you have to support students academically, socially, emotionally, holistically. So in my work, I'm always trying to integrate those pieces and help people see those things as tied and linked. Most, if not all, low-resource children are resilient in some respect, and they are in families that are dealing with challenges that many of us who are educators do not know firsthand. And I think low-resource children become more resilient when we prepare them to succeed in multiple contexts. So when we recognize and acknowledge the success that they've had in their own communities and neighborhoods, when we ensure their success in our middle-class schools, and when we prepare them for the success that most of our schools are organized around preparing students for college and career. We are successful in doing this when we get explicit about what the end goal is. So saying at the very beginning, what are those competencies and skills that we know our students need to have, the knowledge and skills, what they need to know and be able to do if they are to succeed, not only in college or in career, but in the school context that we're creating. And when we include not only academic competencies, but social and emotional ones, when we start to paint that vision, and then talk about as adults what we all need to know and be able to do to support that every day in the school. And all the while doing that while recognizing that kids come to us with specific competencies as well as funds of knowledge. So building on what kids are bringing to schools, and then being really clear about what we're trying to promote and develop or support the development of in students, and then getting really clear as adults, every adult in the building, teachers and social support staff and other staff, around what our role is in supporting that development. Some of the exemplary practice that I've seen in this area include school-wide efforts, and Jen kind of talked about that triangle. I love that triangle. We don't see enough intentional work in the green part of that triangle. The stuff that's happening across the school, meaning it's going on every day in every classroom. The exemplary practice that I've seen in that area has to do with schools who have taken up tribes or second step. But I really think that exemplary practice looks like going beyond a package, because as Jen said, those packages don't fit every student in your classroom. And really getting into kind of the quote that Charles mentioned around the interactions between teachers and students. If we're going to do that green part, that school-wide part well, then we really have to look very closely at what's happening in the classroom and support teachers in engaging in different kinds of ways with kids, ways that teach them. A lot of times we talk about discipline. Discipline, I believe, is teaching. It's not a stick. It's not a punitive program. It's not detention. It's not sending the kid down the hall to the dean or to the social worker to calm them down and get them back in the classroom, but it's teaching. And so we really need to work with teachers to learn how and understand how just having routines helps a child self-regulate because they know what to expect. The things that they can do to build a tolerance of frustration, because in many of our schools we're presenting challenging material to kids because we know they need to work hard and think well and think critically to do well in college and in careers. But we often don't prepare to help them tolerate the frustration that is going to be involved in learning this material. So exemplary practice looks like helping teachers understand the kinds of things that they can embed in their practice that make things predictable, that help children learn how to tolerate frustration and persist through difficult, challenging circumstances, academic material, or relationships, creating agreements with students. Understanding that students can do that with you. We can make agreements together and norms about how we're going to be in our classroom, and then using those opportunities when the agreements are broken as a teaching moment, not as a moment to say, okay, you broke a rule and now you get detention or you get an X on the board or you're on yellow and you're going to be on red in a few minutes, but to use that as an opportunity to teach kids how you handle that. There's a book that I really have been handing out to everybody that's called As Tough as Necessary. I think Mindler is one of the, I left my book over there. I can't cite the name, but Mindler is the last name of one of the writers who talks about, we often set up these disciplinary programs. We say, we're against violence, so if you fight, these are the consequences. And at the same time, in our classrooms, we humiliate students publicly, which is another form of violence. As Tough as Necessary, Countering Violence, Aggression, and Hostility in Our Schools, Kerwin and Mindler. So helping adults in the building think about that. If what we're really valuing and trying to help kids embrace and families embrace are values around living with each other peacefully, then how does your action that is publicly humiliating a child in the moment, which of course we know that teachers are stressed and they're trying to deal with a lot of things, how is that aligned with the value that we're trying to teach our children? So I think exemplary practice is really helping adults understand those things and then working together to understand how we use moment by moment opportunities in the classroom to reinforce and teach those things to kids. Those things aren't in packages. They're not in a curriculum. It's about developing a new set of skills. The other exemplary practice and what I've tried to push the social workers that I've worked with over the years is to have social workers in classrooms to do this work. We have those skills. We've learned development. We've learned how to manage groups. We've done groups with little kids, big kids, adults. I always tell social workers in our schools, you need to be in those classrooms the first 30 days. People should not be referring kids to you in the first 30 days of school because they don't know their kids yet. This is the moment for us to be in the classroom to help teachers develop those cultures of learning that I think was referred to earlier, to collaborate together so that we don't get seen, social workers or social support people get seen as the fix-it people that you send the kid down the hall, but we get seen as the people who are collaborating to support this holistic development of children. So an exemplary practice that I've seen in schools are when social workers are not confined to the little office where they see their kids or they have their groups, but where social workers are in the halls, they're in the classrooms, they're having significant, meaningful conversations with educators around what's happening in the room and talking about teachable moments and playing a role almost as a coach, an advisor, a consultant to teachers to do that nitty-gritty work that happens moment by moment every day, where we have these opportunities to be supporting kids in their social and emotional learning. I'm turn this. And I've seen some teachers do this. I wanted to point out, I've seen teachers kind of take what we know about motivation and integrate that into their classroom, where they're giving kids feedback regularly, where they're not giving them more than they can chew, where they're grouping kids in ways that they can get around to everybody and get to that child who's having a harder time and give them some more skills in coping. So it is work that can be done. I've seen it in classrooms, but I think social workers and social support staff have a key role to play in helping that happen in our schools on a daily basis. One of the things I think that gets in the way, and it's already been mentioned, are the deficit theories that I think abound in urban schooling, that lead us to find problems in the kids and problems in their families, and lead us to hear that, well, these kids don't know how to act, they're out of control, they don't value education, the parent doesn't care. And I think that really gets in the way of us seeing the strengths that children bring to us, understanding some of these, understanding children in different ways. When Margaret talked about the boys and the stance that they're making, what leads us to interpret that stance in one way or another? What leads us to interpret it in a threatening way? How can we kind of interrupt that so that we can take a step back and unpack that, and kind of work around what might be latent deficit theories that we all have operating. So I think that that's one challenge that we just have to work on in terms of interrupting. And I think that often leads us down that role of wanting to control students. So discipline becomes controlling students, and then we create these really elaborative punitive systems in our schools that don't help us get to that end goal that we have in mind. The other thing that I've also mentioned as a challenge already is that a lot of times social workers and social support people are put in that role of fixing the kids. And then these silos are created where we're working down the hall and we see kids in one setting, but we're never working collaboratively and teaming. So we really, as social support folks, need to move ourselves out of that office. Teachers for years have talking about deprivatizing teaching. We need to deprivatize the work that we do and make it public and make it in the classroom, so that people can see what that work is, and I think they'll value it more, and they'll understand that yes, we can do the treatment, but that we really want to use those specialized skills for those kids at the middle and the top of the triangle. Just like when you have a kid who can't learn to read, you don't want to give them to the university kid who's volunteering to tutor. You want to give them to the teacher who understands reading. So we want to use those specialized skills for those kids at the top of the triangle. But we can do that if we spend a lot of our time doing the work in the big section of the triangle with teachers as our partners in the classroom. And I think in terms of where we need to go, for those of us who teach at SSA, and those of us who are already in the field, we need to redefine our roles. We need to redefine the work that we do. We need to prepare social workers to be leaders, to be able to understand what's happening in teaching and learning, talk that language, translate what we do into that language, so that when we go into a classroom and we see a teacher who has great routines, we can talk about what that means for the kids and help them make the connection and see the link between the routines they've put in place and how they're supporting the social emotional learning of the students. I think that we need to understand how to bring our developmental knowledge into the conversation, and use it to interrupt some of what we see in schools. And I think that we also, Margaret mentioned having robust supports and customized supports. I think we need to sharpen our tools in terms of how we're assessing things. We need to be able to assess classrooms and give back that information, just as instructional coaches are walking through the halls and they're assessing the classroom and giving feedback. We need to be able to do that in a way that is systematic and that is disciplined. And we also need to be able to assess our kids in more systematic ways and really think about what do those robust supports look like. I think the days of bringing kids into the room and doing talk therapy are probably limited. If we really want to support kids, we have to talk about, and it's already been mentioned, coping skills. What are the skills you need to do well in this classroom, in this school? And that's the work we need to be doing if we're doing one-on-one or small group work, And in the context of that, we can talk about the skills the kids already have and help them make connections between how maybe the tools I'm using on my way to school aren't the tools that I need to use here at school. Those are the kind of robust supports and the kinds of things that we need to do in our clinical practice that needs to look different. And I think if we get out of the office and into the classroom, we'll begin to see how we need to sharpen those tools that we use routinely. We'll be pushed to use a different set of tools when we're working with kids individually or we're working in small groups, because we won't be in this isolated space where we're creating one-on-one individual relationships with kids that maybe help them process their experiences but might not necessarily help them do well in that classroom. And that'll also enable us to work with the teachers on their skills and give them some more tools in their toolbox, as well as help them perceive things differently so that they can engage with our kids differently as well.
Before I turn them over to your tender mercies, one question for you, point of information. Bryan mentioned the Chicago Student Connection Survey. How many of you have seen that? Well, that's not nearly enough. We will get together and see if we can go find it and print one out and get copies made. It is a completely unique instrument to measure the quality of relationships between adolescents and their schools. To my knowledge, no one in the country does this but Chicago. Right?
Correct.
But it's not getting the kind of use in our community that it needs to get. So we'll find some way to get you copies later. Now I think we'll go directly to questions. So any questions?
Can I make just one point about the survey?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things about the survey is the tendency on the part of even our folks in the building to look at them when the survey results come out and then put them on a shelf. And one of the things that we did in preparing the staff of the turnaround schools for this year was to pull the series of responses from that survey and show them to them in sequence. And sometimes we reverse the sequence, and it created this really interesting and rich conversation about what their attitudes of their children might be as they begin to engage and support them. And it was just really fascinating how it gave us a depth of discussion that I don't think we would have otherwise been able to have. And so as folks look at that, think about how you use it as a tool to really engage folks, to talk about what meaning, what data, what meaning do you place on the data, and what does it suggest about your work and the work of others.
Bryan, could you say something about the kinds of things that survey asks? You mentioned earlier that it asked students do they feel safe.
Sure. It asks a range of questions, including things related to the rigor in the classroom, to the supports that one receives throughout the building, and it also looks at attitudes that students have about learning and their community. So it covers a pretty broad range. I think there are a total of about 4 sections, 50 questions.
Yeah, there are about 58 questions.
58 questions.
And there are 4 indices.
Right.
That said, questions?
You mentioned that feeling of lack of safety or misbehavior and violence. Was mentioned that a feeling of, state of, lack of safety, violence, misbehavior. These all are negative factors for achieving the favorable test scores. So I was wondering if the Chicago public school system, if they found any special ways that have been effective in curbing those negative factors. That's the question.
We've debated for the last 2 years what we could actually do, and part of what you heard described here today was a strategic approach to addressing how students are reacting to the situation that they're in. And so what Jen described was really was informed by all of the research around trauma and violence. There's a study out there called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. I went blank there for a second. And really what that looked at was the cumulative effect of exposure to trauma and violence on the behavior of adults. And the research really focused on a population that had third-party payments, because it was done by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. So this was an insurance company looking at those who they insure. And so these weren't kids in the child welfare system per se, kids that are growing up in poverty. These were folks that had a good enough lifestyle that their employment included insurance. And so what that study found was that with each of those or adverse childhood experiences, there is a significant and documented change in behavior. So you see risky behavior in adults as those experiences accumulate. And so we've tried to use all of the research there to then line that up with what strategies exist out there that we can use to specifically address those components. So I think a lot of what Jen described tried to go at that. The reality is, though, is that at CPS, we're really conflicted because at the same time we're trying to talk about how do you help kids cope with these issues. People are also challenging us to think about how you stop kids from acting in these ways. And we feel far less equipped to think through how you, in the youth violence component of the discussion, feel more equipped to think about how you help students deal with the exposure to violence that they have. And just one statistic that kind of puts the challenge in frame, and that is if you look at the 406 shootings that have occurred since the beginning of last year, and you consider when those shootings occurred, what you'll see is if you take the time from Monday through Friday, 7 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock at night, Monday through Friday, only 20% of the shootings occurred. So the vast majority of shootings are occurring beyond the school day and beyond even the extended school day. And then the other statistic that's worth thinking about is if you look at those same shootings, the distance between the shooting and the home was about 1.5 miles, and the distance between the shooting and the school was about 2.25 miles. So the distance is, they're actually getting shot closer to home than they are to school.
Margaret,
I'm sorry, just because I'm a data geek, and we actually redid this analysis recently to take out the outliers where the kids were shot like 15 miles away. If you take out the outliers, they're shot within 1/2 mile of home and more like 3.5 miles from school. So it's even more pronounced.
Just a couple of very short things. First, I really appreciate being on this panel. I've learned a lot just being a part of this and listening to my colleagues. Just a couple of things. First, let me start with Sybil. I really appreciated your focus on the adult development themes. I just want to make it much more explicit because it's not just our need to support in more custom-like ways the needs of the children, but it's really important to also support their context, i.e. teachers. And so I totally agree. It's important to function as coaches in the classroom, but also as coaches in the building more generally, because there are a couple of studies. One, in terms of teacher fear. No one talks to teachers about their fears about being in those buildings, but yet that's a sort of anecdotal discussion that you'll hear in teachers' break rooms, etc. So being there to help, if you will, unpack those feelings, make a difference in terms of then what happens in a classroom with implications for students' learning. What we found, for example, is that in terms of negative teacher perception, I'm not sure this is on your survey, but we have found this in several states now, the same finding, and that is to the extent that youngsters have negative teacher perceptions, achievement goes down and it's lower. And so in some cases, of course, the negative teacher perceptions have to do with the unacknowledged feelings, the socio-emotional issues that teachers themselves are going through, number one, in terms of teacher fear. But the other piece of that also is teachers' same perceptual process. Teachers infer lack of support from their leadership in the building. makes the teachers feel as if they're not supported. So therefore, what kids are picking up, they may not be doing well academically, but their meaning making, their cognition-based perception of those environments, and significant others like teachers are not, if you will, undermined at all. They pick up how teachers are feeling, and those are interpreted as negative teacher perceptions about self, and kids are not going to take academic risks. And learning is an academic risk-taking enterprise. And you cannot engage in intellectual risk-taking if you're feeling uncomfortable about how you're received in that context. So you're absolutely right. We need to engage in support of adult development themes also, and being all over the building and being able to unpack for the school system what teachers need in order to be perceived as a source of support. They're there as a source of support, but they're not being perceived that way. It's a loss. The second thing about the child piece in terms of supports, again, we have to go beyond the schools because that's where everything is happening. Collaborating with the police department, I think, is critical. I think it's not having a person come in every now and then, but that's a wonderful triangle. And the kids of those the top two need to have a very different experience with the men in blue. They need to be viewed as mentors. I just came from a meeting in San Diego, the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And both in Houston and also in Palo Alto, the programming that's going on there is very innovative in that they really are having police officers to be engaged and supportive as mentors to kids in the communities, because that's where it's happening. That's where they're having these adverse experiences. And when they do that, people come into the police stations, they find kids, stretched down the floor in corners doing homework because they're there for their supports. Are you following me? So very non-traditional supports who are very often viewed as a source of challenge, that can be turned around if we're also thinking at the same time about adult development and needs. Police officers need to go home to their families and feel safe. They need to have more skills to interpret adolescent behavior. And when they have what they need, they are also less reactive in the moment when they're responding to adolescent behaviors that have to do with the nature of the context and its perceived sense of risk for adolescents. So we have, I think, enough data that needs to be spliced together to give us a better sense of what to do for whom, when. The 406 cases of kids being hurt, the immediate thing that should happen when they're at the hospital, they should be given mentors to begin getting support, because what our data suggests is that when kids have been injured 3-4 years later, they have a higher level of this bravado behavior. And the bravado behavior is saying, I do not want to be a victim again. But the bravado behavior is enhancing the probability that they're going to be challenged in other ways. And most importantly, in here, with terms of relationship issues, the bravado behavior that the boys are exhibiting in response to what they perceive as sources of risk, the girls rate that same behavior twice as high as the boys rate it for themselves. So girls are misinterpreting the bravado behavior at a higher rate than the boys. So it's not surprising that we're seeing a lot more violence from girls because they're inferring another message from the boys' self-protecting bravado behavior. So these are very different ways of thinking about human development in context, what we need to do to maximize learning outcomes, because that is what goes to school.
And a related experience that we had here in Chicago that Jen mentioned was to do the de-escalation training for teachers. De-escalation training is nothing new per se. We did something that was a little bit unique here, though, and that was typically the way that training is provided is they set up in a building and you send staff. What we did differently last year, really in response to the schools that were most impacted by the violence, was actually we did a school-wide training in the school. And what it did for the adults, whether you were a lunchroom attendant, a security guard, or a teacher, it gave you the language to express your own feelings about what you were experiencing, as well as to talk in more specific ways about the behavior of students and how you work together to resolve their student issues. And so it was really powerful in that it gave folks a vocabulary and a way of framing the world that made it easier for them to express themselves, their fears, their concerns, their frustrations, and at the same time, it gave them a common language to begin to talk about the behavior of students in ways that were probably far more productive than they would have otherwise been able to do.
Just to add something really quick, we also actually train trainers in each of the schools. So rather than people from the district coming in and doing the training, we ask them to send one administrator, one discipline personnel, one teacher, and one other person, so that the schools were trained by their colleagues.
Charles, just a quick anecdote on this issue of violence. There is a school in our network that they have a morning circle every morning, and then they have an afternoon circle with the whole school community before kids leave, almost as a transition from, okay, the day is over, now you have to transition into the code of the street, and let's be safe, and kind of get your mind ready to go back and get the 3 miles from school to home. So there are things like that schools can do, in response to support kids who are having to deal with violence in their neighborhoods, and violence that's closer to home and not necessarily happening right at the school.
And I would add that one small intervention that has made a significant difference in the level of violence in a number of our schools, including some of the schools in Woodlawn, just south of here, are parent patrols, which can help if they're well organized. But one of the interesting things that we're learning anecdotally, but I'm quite convinced that this is the case, they are quite good mechanisms for parent development. The parents who work on the parent patrols then become more involved in both their schools and their communities in other ways, and some of them say they think differently about their own parenting because there are that closer connection with the schools. So there are a couple of other hands in the middle. There was one right there. And then...
This question has to do with sustainability and the role of the partnership between CPS or other entities with the nonprofit community and access to data. In order for us to make the impact that we have, nonprofit agencies have partnered with the school, and we bring a lot of resources to the school, but we constantly have to keep building our philanthropy to support that. And so what more can we do, or what's being done right now to make this kind of data that CPS has about system-wide, as well as particular schools where nonprofit agencies are involved in, that the nonprofits can use in their philanthropic efforts to continue to support the staff that they have assigned to schools?
Most of the data we talked about here today is publicly available on our website. So the student survey website will get to you later today, but every school's report is publicly available. So you can download individualized school reports, including item-by-item responses. So those are all on a website called cpstoolkit.org. And then our Department of Research and Evaluation makes available the vast majority of our academic performance data by school on our website as well. The discipline data obviously is not publicly available, and nor is the homicide or the shooting data.
However, even though it's not immediately available, it is public information. And so what we have done is aggregate a series of components that we think give you a snapshot of what's going on in the school. Most of the data that we have about behavior wasn't collected for the purposes of understanding behavior. It was collected for the purposes of just reporting it. And so it takes some work to give meaning to that data. But what we have done in the turnaround schools and the behavioral health work that we've been doing in the other 40 schools or so is to break it out by school for them and to make that available to all of the folks that are working in that building. So that includes our own staff, which rarely see this information, as well as the community-based providers that we're working with. And so on the face of it, it doesn't seem to me that we couldn't work with a nonprofit to get them the kind of information that we have access to for their purposes of pursuing additional resources to support their efforts in those schools. So we'd be glad to work with you, and we just have to figure out how to do that. Yeah.
Before we take the final question from Melissa, I would just add that my sense is there's a conversation that is just at the beginning between the local research community and the local foundation community about the importance of social supports, all right? It is just sort of the beginning of a conversation, but it has begun. Melissa will go final.
Okay, I'm going to play the SSA centennial person. So it's the 100th anniversary of SSA, or something like that.
That's the rumor.
Right. So first of all, I want to just do a little advertisement. So Sybil, when are you teaching this year?
Winter quarter I'm teaching.
And this is why we're saying it's a mandatory course. I think she's just demonstrated why you all need to take the course. Every one of these panels is designed to illustrate how we are trying to build the school social work program and community school program in new ways to meet new challenges, but also create new roles for school social workers. And this is a particular challenge, as Jen will acknowledge, because of the traditional roles that school social workers have placed in schools and the traditional training. I want to just end by having every panel please think about what's the challenges that you're posing to SSA, what's the challenges you're posing to public policy about creating these new roles for school social workers, and where can SSA be 25 years from now? I can't think of 100 years. You're thinking 50, I'm thinking 25. Go ahead, Jen.
I think we really need people who can focus on the green part of the triangle. So I need social workers who are comfortable walking into a classroom of 30 kids and helping a teacher think about how to manage 6 things at the same time and set up the structures and the routines and teach kids the rules and the expectations so that that functioning is productive and contributes to social and academic development. I think that even in terms of our social workers who are phenomenally interested in doing the group work and the individual work and can think about how to integrate their IEP kids with non-IEP kids and roll that all up together in a day, that's the biggest challenge that we've run up against so far, is that people do not understand the context of the classroom. And I'm obviously in a unique situation because I taught before I came to SSA. So I'm a lot more comfortable than most of my colleagues, and it probably shouldn't have been a surprise, but that was a surprise to me because I think as Margaret and Sybil did a good job pointing out, it really is just about how people interact with one another and how to organize those interactions most effectively in the context of a classroom to achieve your goals. But that is, I think, the biggest thing we could use substantial help with.
I actually didn't graduate from SSA, but taught here for 7 years. And the 2 things that I would point out that I think continue to be a challenge for social workers. One is the part about using statistics and data once you leave here. There's so much of the world that's being driven by it, and you're being trained to use it. But so often when we're having discussions in school buildings about data, the social workers are nowhere to be seen, and their contribution to that discussion is hard to find. And so it's not just what you learn here, but it's being willing to take that with you and continue to use it when you're out there in the world. And then the one other thing that I'd point out that continues, I think, to be a challenge for SSA specifically, and that's around the broader planning skills that folks have. You guys leave here with great skills to plan for individual kids or families, but when you are doing organizational planning, say at the school level, being articulate about how to structure that thought process, how to think logically and sequentially, and to lay out a process that others can follow and participate in is really critical to the change process, because in CPS, the change process occurs school by school by school. It's not central office making a bunch of decisions and then shoving them down the throats of teachers and administrators. It's school by school making these decisions, and so the extent to which social workers are comfortable using the data with their peers, demonstrating the best ways to use that data, and being able to be logical and consistent and coherent in the planning of interventions for the larger school environment, I think those are two critical skills that either need to be emphasized or need to be redoubled to make sure that you can do those two things.
I think we have to wrap up now, but I'll take the chair's prerogative to be the last person to respond to Melissa. To say, I hope you've gotten a sense from the panel that in a lot of respects, for all the issues we have with Chicago Public Schools, on this question they're ahead of the nation, ahead of most of the nation. And in a broad sense, SSA is quite well positioned to play an extraordinary leading role in this discussion. Part of that is Melissa. And the fact that she's created this long and deep tradition of us working with Chicago Public Schools, so that the work we do is not a parallel universe, right? It doesn't exist separate from and apart from the school. Part of that is Mike's work, which puts us, his research, which puts us at the really center of some of the national conversations about social supports. Part of that is our partnership with the Urban Education Institute, of which I cannot remember the name since it's new, which gives us a kind of access to clinical knowledge which is rare, right? All of that is good, because the one thing I have the strongest sense about is that while there is a conversation among the leadership of CPS about these issues, which is heartening, there is a fierce conversation in the schools. I will bet you I have gone, since over the course of this fall, to one meeting a week at which someone in schools were saying, can you help us do this? Can you help us start student support teams? Can you help us start gender-based clubs? Can you help us do classroom management? At least one meeting a week off all, right? There is enormous demand and growing demand, I think, for the kinds of things that we can do. And with that, let us thank the panel one more time.